welcome again to another episode. Today, I want us to look at poetry. If you have not subscribed to our YouTube channel, please do so that it can help our content to be pushed to more people. Onto it. Poetry in high school is divided into two. We have what we call oral poetry or poetry for performance purposes, which is tested under English Paper 1. We have literary or comprehensive poetry, which is tested under English Paper 2. This is the kind of poetry that I want us to focus on in our session. So what exactly is poetry? Literary or comprehensive poetry encompasses deep poetry that we really appreciate, poetry that will address a myriad of issues. Now, when it comes to this kind of poetry, which will be tested under English Paper 2, Question 3, it is normally alternated between a poem or a song, sometimes a song, or a narrative. So in these years, 2024 KCSE examination, we are anticipating that a poem will be tested or an oral song or a song. So what exactly is a poem? What exactly is this poetry that we are talking about? First of all, always try to relate the title of the poem with the rest of the poem. So look at the title. Most of the time, the title will carry a thematic message. It can carry a particular message. So you begin with the title and try to relate it with the rest of the poem. So after going through the title, for example, consider a title of a poem called War is Kind. War is kind because children are now orphans. War is kind because women or wives or women are now widows. War is kind because people have been killed. So if you look at this poem, the title, you definitely know that the poet is trying to employ use of irony, and the title itself is ironic because war cannot be said to be kind, and yet people are being killed and children are being left orphans. So always relate the poem with the rest of the poem. Consider another poem called White Man Meets a Black Man Meets a White Child. So again, you should consider, why are we not saying a man meets a child? Why are we putting color? Black man and white child. Why are we including color in the title? Maybe there's an aspect of racism. So again, it's always good to consider the poem in terms of the title, if there is one. We are not saying that all poems are going to have titles, but in the event that a poem has a title, then try to relate it. Most of the time, the title will play a thematic role. It's a pointer towards what the poem is talking about. So, the analysis of a poem, first of all, consider the poetic persona, the voice speaking in a poem. Identify that voice in terms of responsibility, in terms of the role they are playing, in terms of even age. Is it a child? Is it a mom? Is it a boy? Is it a husband? Is it a wife? Is it a crop? What is the voice speaking in the poem? So identify it and illustrate. Identify it and illustrate in terms of the functionality that is playing within that piece of poem. What is the poem about? You approach this question in two dimensions. One, you can use the episodic approach, where you highlight events within the poem, or two, you can use what you call the thematic approach, the main message that the poet wants or is raising, the points, the message that the poet wants us to appreciate within that particular poem. So what is the poem about? Read the poem and simply tell us in terms of the thematic or episodic happening. Then number two, also they could ask you about the main message in a poem. That is direct message. What are you learning? What are you taking home from a given poem, and what have you? They can also ask you a question on meaning. Meaning in poetry can be looked at from two dimensions. The first dimension is the direct surface meaning, which is brought out. The direct meaning which is brought out in a poem. Number two, it can be the hidden, figurative, or metaphoric meaning. At KCSE level, any type of meaning is acceptable. So as learners, do not go kill yourself with the hidden meaning because it's prone to misinterpretations. So you can focus mainly on the direct implied meaning. Now, we have also what we call poetic devices. All the sound pattern in paper 1, when they cross over to paper 2, they become poetic devices. So it's all of them are acceptable. So I will not talk about alliteration, I will not talk about assonance, I will not talk about consonants, I will not talk about rhyme. But once they cross over, the only difference is that in paper 1 they enhance rhythm or musicality. In paper 2 they serve another purpose. We don't have rhythm as such. Mainly we are focusing on literary aspects in a given poem. So what are the poetic devices? Major ones, there are so many, poetry, there are so many poetic devices. Please ignore. Do not focus on all of them. Just focus on what will most likely appear in a poem and which are within the syllabus of high school. So focus on the direct ones such as repetition, and know the importance of repetition, which of course repetition helps to emphasize on the subject matter. Repetition helps to emphasize on the subject matter. So this is where a line, a word, a phrase is used more than once to serve the purpose of emphasis, to emphasize on a given subject matter. Other poetic devices will include imagery. They can ask you to explain an image, point out an image in a poem. So this is usually a problem. It has been problematic for most candidates and students. So if they ask you to point out an image in a poem, consider similes. These are words that we comparison, words that show comparison using terminology such as us, and like. She's like a mouse. He is like a giraffe. We call that similes. So simile is an example of an image. And remember, image. The purpose of an image in a poem is to create mental impressions about the subject matter, to create mental pictures about the subject matter. So simile is one of them. Have metaphor. Metaphor is comparison without using those comparison terminologies. When you say she is a mouse, or he is a lion, or she is a lioness, for example, you are comparing without using those comparison terms. We call that metaphor. It's also an image. You have personification, where you give human attributes to animals, to inanimate things and objects. You make them look like they are humans. They laugh, they talk, they cry, they share in human emotions. We call that one personification. It's also an image. It's also a poetic device. And then we also have what we call symbolism. Symbolism is when you use one thing to represent another thing. One idea, one thing can represent an idea, or an idea can represent a whole new thing. So again, we call that symbolism. For example, light in poetry could represent maybe enlightenment or education, and so on. So that is called symbolism. There are images. So they can ask you, point out 2 images. Maybe they want you to point out a simile, or a metaphor, or personification, or symbolism, and so on. So please focus on that when they ask you about imagery in poetry. If they have not asked you about imagery, these images are poetic devices in isolation. So if it's one which appears there, then you should point it out. Another common poetic device is called rhetorical questions. Rhetorical questions are questions, of course, which don't need one-to-one answers, because the answer is obvious or implied. Rhetorical questions serve the purpose of, they make the reader to think deeply about the subject matter. So they'll make you to think about the subject matter. That's the function of rhetorical question. We have, of course, irony. We have use of humor. Juxtaposition, contrast, highlighting similarities and differences. It's called juxtaposition. We have these styles. This style called apostrophe, where you address a dead person or an absent subject as if it were there and it could respond. It's called apostrophe. Humor, there's use of humor. I don't know if I've mentioned that. There are so many poetic devices that you can point out, but these are the basic ones, and you should not forget them. Don't dwell on Metonym and what have you, and forget the basic ones, which most likely are going to be asked in an examination situation. Enjambment, where information spills over to the next line, and what have you. All those are poetic devices that I want you to know, even as you revise for KCSE. Now, other questions are common one. They can ask you to make notes, they can ask you to paraphrase, they can ask you to summarize any information. Please consider the points I gave you on comprehension skills. If you have forgotten, then go back to one of my YouTube classes just to joggle your memory and so on. Now, another highlight of poetry, another major highlight of poetry has to do with tone, mood, and attitude. Tone, mood, and attitude. So very quickly, I just want to mention them for the sake of your understanding. Now, tone refers to the voice quality of the persona that helps to reveal attitude. The voice, how is the voice coming out? It's called tone. How is the voice? Is it satirical? Is it condescending? Is it mocking? How is the voice that is telling us the poem coming out? So we call that one tone. And of course, we have a whole list of words used to describe tone that I will address in subsequent YouTube classes. So that one is called tone. The voice quality of the persona that helps to reveal attitude is called tone in poetry. We also have what we call mood. Mood refers to the atmosphere that engulfs a poem, that particular atmosphere that you create, that's created especially by this choice of words, the kind of poem, depending with the kind of poem that you are reading. If you are reading about a sad poem, maybe the mood is sad. If you are reading about death of an important person in a given setup, maybe you're talking about a somber mood. So mood is the general feelings that surround a given poem, especially as evoked in you as you're trying to read a given poem, or you're going through, or as you're going through a given poem. That one is called mood. Whatever surrounds a given poem is called mood. Then lastly, attitude is the persona's feelings towards the subject matter. What are the feelings? What does the persona or even the poet think about the subject matter? Is it despising? Is it liking? Is it satiric? Which kind of attitude, as you look at it, is it pessimistic? Is it optimistic? Now, we are being discouraged from giving general attitude. Don't say negative attitude or negative or positive attitude. Instead, you should narrow down to specific negative or positive attitude. So please, in poetry, we don't encourage the use of general terms in describing attitude. Of course, as I've said, in my subsequent YouTube classes, I will focus more on these words that are used to describe tone, mood, and attitude. So if you focus on those spheres that I've just mentioned, then you will score highly in poetry. Remember, this kind of poetry will test on your deep understanding of a given poem, your ability to analyze a given poem and be able to digest it and respond to various components that I have mentioned. So that is it for today. Remember, if you like this content, like, comment, and even hit the subscription button so that our content can reach more people. Until next time, it is goodbye.